Well, the man who's been helping me out trying to find words for the last few minutes is Gareth who? Gareth Hughes.
Gareth.
Good morning.
Good morning, Catherine.
Brigitte Morten is with us also. Kia ora, Brigitte.
Kia ora.
Gareth is a member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa and a former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party. Brigitte is a director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, former senior ministerial advisor for the previous national-led government, a National Party member, and volunteers during elections for its deputy leader, Nicola Willis. Right, hard not to start with the geopolitical earthquake that the New Zealand government is navigating along with everyone else. The transatlantic alliance appearing to be fracturing. The foreign minister in Beijing, after the aftermath of the Chinese warships exercises in Australia. Let's start with Europe. I think the New Zealand government put out a statement in support of Ukraine following that confrontation in the White House between President Zelensky and Trump. New Zealand you can imagine what the foreign affairs officials are doing at the moment, Gareth, trying to make sense of all this.
And it's not often that, geopolitics and international relations flow into domestic politics, but you can't ignore this. This is, the biggest story in the world and probably in New Zealand as well. And look, it's shocking what we saw in the Oval Office with that sort of dress down, that ambush of Zelensky. Simon Marks, the RNZ reporter over there, said, Trump was reported to say this was going to make great TV. Perhaps that was the purpose, but it's shocking seeing in real time the sort of geopolitical foreign policy system, the stability that's gone from 1945 to 2024 basically erode. And Zelensky, post that meeting, he left the White House without signing that agreement over minerals. He must have spent the next couple of hours on Twitter acknowledging all the world leaders, including our Prime Minister, who were issuing support. Much more warm response in the United Kingdom. But for New Zealand, this is a huge problem. How do we handle it? How do we keep our head down from the eye of Sauron, as it's been described by an academic, with Trump looking at us? Will we get blowback if he discovers our nuclear-free policy, if American ships can't dock here? He wasn't particularly on top of what even AUKUS was in a meeting last week. But then again, how do we stand up for our traditional values and the rules-based order, which New Zealand has articulated so loudly? It's in a really tough position. It was good to see former Prime Minister Helen Clark over the weekend on Q&A discussing just how we navigate this very tricky situation.
Brigitte?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's times like this where I'm grateful that we have generally agreement across the political parties about what we should be doing in the Foreign Affairs Department. I think you can see a lot of Trump's rhetoric has come out of the fact that he sees it as a political winner to sort of have these fights, where you can imagine if the same thing was happening in New Zealand, that would actually be massive blowback against our political leaders. So I do think we just have to be grateful sometimes for that mature response that we have in our political debate. Without a doubt, I think this has changed, our conversation about what's happening around China. We're often very careful because of that large export risk that we have. But that exercise last week in the Tasman Sea was so out of order that it has meant that we had to have responded more strongly. And I do think that we are going to see at the budget, as it's been well signalled by many, an increase to that defence spending, because if we're going to be seen as respecting that world order, we have to be seen as contributing to that military puzzle and making sure we're alongside with our allies.
Out of line in terms of the lack of warning, which is what the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister have mainly pointed to, the Foreign Minister in what I presume is a pre-scheduled visit to Beijing. But the other thing I think that is bubbling away here, apart from fear about global security, is the potential impacts on global trade. If we start to see real upheaval here to the world order, and New Zealand, the whole point about America First is America First's own economy can by and large sustain it, certainly relative to an economy that depends on export income, Gareth. And this is multifactorial, as they say.
And that was always the trade-off. Our major trading partner was China. Was willing to do a free trade agreement with us, but the security relationship was with the States. What we're seeing now is an increasingly unreliable security relationship. Europe isn't now counting on America being there as part of the NATO partnership and even exploring alternative security arrangements internally. And yet America has never signed a free trade agreement with New Zealand and have put tariffs on us in the past. So, we can't continue this path.
All right, Brigitte, staying with the Foreign Minister, being in Beijing, a strong personal relationship with an equally experienced counterpart there, and making the point and trying to be forward-looking and doing so that he would hope for more warning in the future. How would you rate the success of that visit?
Well, I suppose the success comes to what China does next. If we see another exercise like we did last week, or a failure to warn, obviously not very successful. But I do think, and maybe I'm just feeling a bit too grateful today, but I think Winston Peters was very well positioned to take that meeting and was, very well versed, knew what he was talking about, made it very clear that we were unhappy with what had happened. As you can see, also Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong making similar noises as well. I think that we did basically the best that we can, but ultimately we don't know what impact that has until we see how China acts next.
And such a contrast with what we saw in the Oval Office. The fireworks, the Twitter, the social media. This was much more sort of mature, diplomatic. And, I think Peters was right to urgently make that trip. He was very solid. He stood up and said, something relatively strong in diplomatic terms. There was a failure in the relationship over the lack of warning, over the live fire exercises, and got somewhat of a surprising acknowledgement from the Chinese government around the need to consult New Zealand and our expertise in the Pacific. So I think handled very well.
Yeah, and of course also under discussion was the Cook Islands agreement, which continues to be a sore point in particular for New Zealand. And again, the relationship with the Cook Islands, it is not a fully independent country. It has a strong interrelationship. The interest in those extremely valuable deep sea minerals and cobalt, the little kind of, what do they call them, the nodules in the Cook Islands. This is all going to be so challenging to navigate, right, for New Zealand going forward. I think the other thing I'm noting, Brigitte, and I know you're a keen follower of Australian politics, those polls have been suggesting the likelihood of a change of Prime Minister there to potentially to Peter Dutton. I know there was some recent polls after the first interest rate cut they'd had in a long time, Australia, a brief sort of blip for the incumbent government. But that election is going to be ever more closely watched given what's happening at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen there that they have much more of a politicisation, particularly around defence and defence spending. And so I think you're going to see much more of a push from the Liberals to really put more of that debate up and front. They are debating similar issues to what we went into our election with, because cost of living is the biggest thing there. But ultimately, we've also seen from Dutton some calls that we as New Zealand are not carrying our weight in regards to defence spending. So if he, brings that up again, I think it's going to put pressure, even more pressure, on the New Zealand government to spend money in the budget.
Well, there's that. There's the fact that I think, if I'm correct, I read that what was a white paper under the Labour Party and then became a defence strategy under the incoming government and was fairly due to go to Cabinet may now have been pushed back. It may be being rewritten at pace. It's incredible, Gareth, to watch the speed at which Europe is making announcements this weekend about its intention for military spending. There's no question any strategy that was written last year is possibly being scrutinised here again as well.
That's right, and deeply disappointing, however, that the British defence increase is going to come out of overseas aid. We're seeing the same in US aid in the States and their funding there, and this is, I guess we'd look back historically.
It's coming out, wasn't it? Not coming out of the sanctions profits, the UK one that was announced over the weekend.
No, I believe they've halved their overseas aid development assistance.
Okay, thank you.
Which is of course having a blowback within the Labour Party internally in the UK, and this is the challenge for our government, because we actually saw defence spending dropped 6% in the last budget. We're under 1%, 0.9%. Clearly it's been signalled that we're going to increase our expenditure. But if we're going to go to 2%, where's this additional $5 billion going to come from? Are they going to look at reducing assistance, which would be counterproductive in the Pacific, given the States is pulling out and we need to have an obligation and a role to support our Pacific whānau? But this is like a wake-up call, and I think historically we're going to look back at it like more than 100 years ago with the Russian scare. These deep water vessels from the Chinese Navy, this is no longer a coastal fleet. This is the world's largest navy, not by tonnage. It is a bit of a wake-up call that geopolitics is changing. So it's inevitable we're going to see an increase in defence expenditure, but I don't think it's particularly calm that the Prime Minister last week was saying he's going to send a ship back to the South China Sea. I mean, this is just going to inflame tensions, and if we're going to continue to send vessels through there, Prime Minister Clark is right. It's tit for tat.
Former
Prime Minister Clark is going to. It's that American nomenclature.
I know they just keep calling them that.
But she's right. We're going to see tit for tat. If we keep sending vessels up there, they're going to keep sending vessels down here.
Which is the interesting point, Brigitte, that I think you were alluding to, which is the experience of Winston Peters as a foreign minister in multiple different governments. And again, this is exposure for Christopher Luxon. Not only as an inexperienced Prime Minister, but as an inexperienced politician, full stop, Brigitte.
I think in terms of that, just going back to the Vietnam sort of announcement, that was around that trade delegation. And I think that's actually where we've seen the PM really excel. There's a great article, I think, by Jason Walls in the Herald talking about, that contrast between the Hoskins interview, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and this, what he did in the trade delegation and signing that agreement. I think what that signal was about sending a ship up there was a little bit actually from us saying, actually, we're not going to be just pushed around. Our foreign minister was in Beijing making it clear on that. This is another version of that as well. I'm a little bit more wary or not so supportive, I suppose, of former PM Helen Clark's comments. You saw in Q&A that she sort of initially went for quite a push about us pulling out of Five Eyes and then had to walk it back because, of course, we need an intelligence network. We cannot sustain that kind of behaviour, and have those kind of insights by ourselves. So I do think that there's a little bit of former Prime Minister coming in here, perhaps not having all the current information about all that inside intelligence, but making some pretty bold claims into the media.
OK, let's stay with the Prime Minister and his communications issues. As I was saying earlier, it's extraordinary that we had a minister resign a week ago, just after we came off air, actually. Andrew Bailey resigning as Commerce and Consumer Affairs Minister, and by the end of the week we were all talking about an interview with the Prime Minister about it, and not about the substance of it. Let's start with the substance of it. Once you might get away with it, twice you won't, in terms of a behavioural issue, Gareth, or is this also a sign perhaps that without knowing the details, we don't know the details, things that used to happen inside Parliament, there's less tolerance for now and a bit more accountability for, sometimes anyway.
Oh, and rightfully so. We shouldn't be touching other people in heated arguments. And, it was tried to be spun in the media release that he was, impatient with the change within the government, with the public service. Look, I mean, this is not particularly good political management. This incident occurred, I believe, last Tuesday. We didn't find out about it publicly till a week. The weekend was Monday. So, 6 days. He resigned his portfolios on Friday night, yet we weren't publicly informed until the weekend. There was no clear explanation. We're still really in the dark about what actually occurred in this incident, and was it aggressive, or was he really just the victim of a second strike and you're out, maybe on the lower end of the spectrum? We just don't know. So, of course, it leads to speculation. But you're right, the Prime Minister by the end of the week made it about himself, even on a pretty successful diplomatic trip to Vietnam. This is what he was questioned about by the New Zealand journalists, and that interview was frankly a train wreck. And when Mike Hoskins, one of the champions and advocates and cheerleaders of the Prime Minister, is saying you're making a complete mess of it, you've lost the audience. And the fact is, I just think the problem is, and we've seen other people offer their communications advice, his strategy to sort of memorise these lines and these slogans and talking points and repeat them ad nauseum. I think the strategy works when he's counting on a single soundbite being on the news that night, and that's all the public ever sees. However, when people actually see a long-form interview like this where he's repeating the same lines, unable to give a clear yes or no answer, he comes a cropper. And the fact is, for this, he looked indecisive. He looked like he didn't really know why he couldn't say yes or no, that he would have sacked him.
Yeah, Brigitte, it went further than just spin, which irritates the hell out of people. And I sometimes wonder about the comms industry and the advice it gives to people. The best communicators I've dealt with in politics do their own comms, know what they want to say and what the impact will be, and say it. But this went beyond trying to spin something to the point where people were wondering if he even knew what he would have done in the circumstances.
Yeah, it shows how quickly that, one comms opportunity can undermine a whole bunch of work. Because you've seen, I think, particularly with this Prime Minister, actually that he had a reputation for expecting performance out of his ministers. The quarterly to-do list that were really held to account, the fact that he did an early cabinet reshuffle where he moved people on for underperforming. All of those things are for naught if you cannot communicate that and demonstrate that in what you're saying. So I think that was definitely a loss for him. Just turning back to one of the points that Gareth made, though, around timing, the flip side, or the other side, I think, of now having higher standards for how people perform in Parliament is also we've got more process around making sure that the people that are affected, and I'm really using the word victim, but the person that is, at the centre of that incident, that they are actually properly looked after. You can just look back a couple of years, and if that person previously, they probably would have been very quickly been known by the media, very quickly kind of drawn out. Actually, there was a proper process followed this time, and that a proper investigation, questions answered, handled by ministerial services and not handled by politicians. And I think that's something that we actually need to have respect for, because if we had a whole lot more dirty details about what, was a grab or a touch, we're actually getting very close to actually putting that person actually on further show. And I think that's one of the things that we actually need to be conscious of, particularly in this sort of political commentary kind of industry, is that actually we need to be more protective of those people.
Okay, the fact is, he is now finding himself in the most difficult, as we've discussed, geopolitical situation of any Prime Minister, probably going back decades, potentially, right? So he's got to sort out what he says domestically and full stop. And, how do you go about addressing that, Bridget? Like, Prime Ministers learn in the most difficult job to learn on the job there is, but how are they going to ensure that things improve? Whether it's just explaining domestic policy or certainly on these major issues where every word can count.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it comes down to the Prime Minister himself. I think he's the only person accountable for this. You can talk about comms advisors and media advisors, but at the end of the day, he's the one responsible. So I'm sure he's taken some pretty strong lessons out of last week's interview. He will have seen all of the rhetoric that we've all seen, and he will know that that's going to affect his impression of the polls. So he needs to get on top of that, and it comes down to him being willing to make a stand and say, actually, I got that wrong. This is what I'm doing to correct it.
I mean, what's crucial to understand is communication is a key role of the role of Prime Minister. And Ardern got a bit of flack, but we're actually seeing how crucial it is. He's got to unlearn some of those
She got flack for some of her word salads as well, actually. She could be brilliant on the one hand and could fall into the same trap on the other. But the other point behind this is you also need to know your stuff.
That's right. And Cameron Slater had a very interesting article giving it a bit of an internal perspective, that he points out that Luxton, is pretty new to politics, pretty new to the National Party. He doesn't have a faction behind him. He doesn't have these key allies that guard him, back his corner. He's a bit adrift in a caucus, and perhaps that was some of the unease over the interview, that he was thinking about how his colleagues would react to his comments rather than him being decisive as Prime Minister.
We need to crack through a couple more important things to get through. The 4-year referendum proposition, I'll put it that way. Interesting. I've just trying to read Sir Geoffrey Palmer's reaction to this. Look, on the one hand, the concept of having a referendum on a 4-year term is not new. But then when you actually read what was proposed in the legislation that's to go to the Select Committee in the first instance, there's all these caveats. You can only do it if you change the majorities or change the proportionality of Select Committees. Not only that, it would have to be revisited at the start of every term. Does it stand to show in its current form, Gareth?
No, I don't think so. I think they've made something pretty clear and understandable, something obtuse and confusing. So ACT's proposal is a standard term of Parliament will remain at 3 years, but with the ability to extend the maximum term of Parliament for the main condition being that certain select committees calculated in a way that's proportionate to the non-executive Parliament. I mean, I understand what they're saying, but I think Joe Bloggs, as a citizen, wouldn't have a foggy. And the fact of the matter is, what ACT's proposing is you beef up some of the membership of the opposition on select committees as a bit more scrutiny. But the fact is, in a unicameral or a single House of Parliament, no upper house, no strong judiciary that's striking down legislation, that is one of the most weakest ways you could address the power imbalance. And that's what Sir Geoffrey was pointing out, that he's a supporter of 4-year terms, but you've got to address some of these other fundamental power imbalances.
Bridget, you can't also be deciding at the start of a term whether you're going to be a 3 or a 4-year term. The point's also been made, I'm sorry I can't remember by whom, that you need to have some kind of a lining up with when local government elections are held. What I want to ask you after your comment is this an opportunity where National and Labour might come in with their own legislation and come to an agreement and say, right, let's put it out there as a referendum, but without this stuff attached? What do you think?
Well, I think firstly, from a 4-year term, the problem we've got is the fact that nobody can define the actual problem. So there's a lot of questions around there that we need better, like long-term thinking. And
it's the fact that by year 2, you're starting to get ready for an election, right?
Well,
and the election's never not on your mind.
No. So that's not the problem. That's a kind of a symptom, right? You're saying there basically that this is what we think politicians are doing. It's year 2 now. We know that many of the politicians are actually very focused. Just look at Chris Bishop's infrastructure levy announcement from last week on very substantial reform. So they know that there's an election coming next year, but part of that equation is the accountability that's coming. But going back to talking about this in a sort of communications, or what is Joe Bloggs, going to understand out of this, they haven't made the case. There's nothing in the announcement last week or that ACT has really gone hard on to say this is why this is so important and so needed. So I really worry that we're going to go down the pathway of the flag referendum again, where everyone comes out and goes, oh yeah, this kind of sounds about right, but why would we start to get down in some of these details, and we've just wasted a whole lot of money and time on a referendum, when frankly there's some much bigger problems that we could be solving in New Zealand.
Okay. Couple of quick hits, please. The first, the arrest powers. Is this a case where a minister makes what he thinks will be a really popular statement and then finds out everybody's actually got some reservations about it?
You've only got Destiny Church coming out in support.
What happened, do you think?
Well, it wasn't particularly good communications around it. The minister didn't seem to particularly be able to explain it all. And, people are worried about vigilantism, the risk to workers. People have died trying to do this at the past. I am sympathetic. We do have existing citizen arrest powers on the book. They only apply at night time, which I do seem a little bit surprising. Maybe you need a modernisation, but this isn't the answer to retail crime as they're positioning it.
Okay, Brigitte.
Oh, absolutely. I think they absolutely failed in terms of the comms around this, because as Gareth points out, actually you can do a citizen's arrest right now. It's actually not just at night. You can during the day, but it's got different provisions around it. It is a mess. They should have solved that problem first before saying this is what our solution is. And absolutely they should have got the retail industry fully on board before they came out with an announcement.
The infrastructure levy. Now, just help us with what's proposed here. We'd spoken last year, quite a way back, with Chris Bishop, the minister here, about this idea of value capture, right? That if you have, a new public thoroughfare or some kind of new infrastructure development near your property that's going to raise its value, you come up with the levy. Is that what's actually being proposed, Bridget? What was it in the end?
Yeah, I'm going to say in short that yes, that is basically where we're at. So they are allowing for councils to put that levy in place. So essentially that development is getting paid by the people who are actually experiencing the development, compared to at the moment where you essentially have existing residents having to pay for that new development. I think it's really clever. First of all, it makes it really clear who's getting the benefit there for who's paying the cost. And also the fact that, remember back when ACT was really against the sort of medium density housing, this is essentially the argument against it, was that you had to support councils to be able to develop the areas around it. This cuts out one of those areas of backlash, and I think that's why it was smart politics and also smart policy.
And it's been generally welcomed by the sector. I think cautiously the devil's always going to be in the detail. The idea of a levy over a development contribution and a regulator seems a good one. I guess the risk, however, it's another example where they're taking away discretion and the ability to actually make choices from local government. So Christchurch, for example, they're doubling their development contributions at the moment. That's now going to go into a never-never zone, and this is still going to take a couple of years for this new policy on the levy to be rolled out. So no silver bullet to our housing crisis.
Just finally, I mentioned that the Foreign Minister Winston Peters had been in South Korea. He's also, of course, Minister for Rail after the reshuffle that happened over the ferry, the IREX cancellation, and then the Finance Minister coming out with, what was it,
rail capable?
No. The word she used, a proposal, a
white elephant.
No, stop it. a workable proposal, Bridget. I think it was March, wasn't it, that the Minister for Rail was going to come back and see if he had a better one. Do we have some hopes that there might have been some useful meetings while in South Korea?
Yeah, there seems to be some reports out there that there has been some proposals from private industry and that they do have some options on the table, so that is pointing to positives. I mean, what Winston Peters has done here is made it very clear that he's the one that has taken responsibility for this, and he'll be the one that makes the decision on this. So it'd be really interesting to see whether he gets that job done.
Well, I mean, it's ironic, right? We were going to get these ferries next year, and instead we're going to get them at the end of the decade. We might not even have rail enabled. It's just rail capable. Well, you've got to double handle everything. I think what's interesting from a political perspective is Peters does have responsibility for this now. If he has a proposal that there isn't enough funding to achieve, will he throw his toys out of the cot, and could this disrupt the government formation? He's obviously, I think, going to be pushing as hard as he can for a good ferry solution, but funding is tight. Is this going to be a source of conflict in the coalition?
I think we're starting to see any plans for the budget that may have been a month ago or 2 months ago are going to perhaps be looking different by the time we get to May. I was interested that he was meeting the shipbuilder Hyundai Mipo while in South Korea, it is reported, and I suppose it's a question of whether some kind of Lazarus deal can be negotiated, not the one that was originally signed, but...
Oh, they're the biggest shipbuilders in the world, so I mean they're probably open for work, but I'm sure they'll also be looking at the deal with extra attention, given the way we acted. And we still don't have the detail how much this break fee is going to cost. We still don't know, when we're going to get these ferries, where they're going to come from, or how much it's going to cost to cancel the ones we were going to get.
Credible proposal, I think, was the word I was straining for. You didn't help me this time, Gareth, at all. Thank you,
Sorry,
Gareth
Catherine.
Hughes, Brigitte Morten. Thanks very much for your time.